Development and Self-Determined Act, where it would allow for tribal ownership and joint ventures of renewable projects, but terror precludes their development. That's portion 12. Gigantic tribal beyond the passive cluster of tribes are authorized to enter into business agreements without limitations. The kind of structure energy resource agreement would be free to enter into a joint operating agreement to draw back as an Indian tribe as first entry into a terror. Terror requires the tribe to meet numbers that criteria developing the environmental review process for each only handful even potentially meets that last requirement, although several expressed interest in a terror. No tribe has submitted a terror application to fund and cost of time, money, and staffing to develop a terror driver their approval or prohibited. The background cost of environmental review and addressing public affairs are substantial. The terror process may be a barrier and federal interference. Blocked energy development in indigenous lands such as Inland Land 27, only one commercial renewable energy project operating all of indigenous countries, community, and natural resources set out to determine why federal regulations and laws slow development occurs and disencourage businesses to invest in the plan. The United States federal government should end the requirement that indigenous nations in the United States enter into a tribal energy resource agreement prior to the forming of a non-leasing business agreement for solar and wind projects by indigenous lands and the land set aside that the United States federal government refers to as Native Americans or American Indians. In attention, one is the principles of U.S. energy policy, devalue indigenous peoples, and uphold genocide. Terrorists undermine self-determination by dictating conditions under which indigenous peoples can control their resources. That's Unger and 10. The regulations specify provisions that a nation and terror subsequent agreements must contain inconsistent with the real control over development of the government dictates the terms under which nations take control of resource development's right remains unfulfilled. And these paternalistic policies devalue indigenous peoples into passive object lacking autonomy that's carried by before the subject by itself by encountering and authorized or carrying of the author than rather in the sense of using as objects rather than subjects. The indigenous person emerges in American discourse as the object. The indigenous person has not the power to act more. The knowledge dominated to deny autonomy to as it exists and as we know it. These processes negate to value the value of life and justify extermination. That's still in 99. Topicality required of sovereign's objectivity gave rise to expendability. The value of the subject became the standard unit of currency for political accountability. Once rendered accountable, the units of account are submissible to devaluation to the point of counting as nothing. The 0 point of Holocaust, the invaluable may lose its purchase on life, and amoral utilitarianism serves only to rationalize genocide against expendable populations and mass underlying resources in the same seemingly humanitarian gestures. That's Cohen and 12. And more utilitarianism disguises the hatred, the ritual enemy behind the wronging of thousands of native populations in defense of colonization around the globe. This doctrine has been promulgated by Mill as an answer to what to do with a population that does not seem to advance the good for the majority. Democratized use of utilitarianism to lend an air of justice and compassion. The reality of outright mass elimination of unwanted people, elimination is ongoing, and assaulting humanity in general, American Indians in particular. There's little difference between eliminations in previous centuries and those occurring at our time. In Armenia and Africa, a simple working definition of the name of humanitarian acts can be devised, genocide can be denied, and legislation can go forward as though no crime has been committed. In contention 2 is the practice of U.S. energy policy destroys tribes. Trust protection in the Sasco manifests as colonialism. Indigenous nations are forced to either mark exploitative environmentally harmful agreements and a false choice between destitution and devastation. Let's go in 9. Exploitation of conventional resources that colonial pharaoh nations supplied access to natural resources and trust protection at rock bottom pricing and sweetheart deals were ruined by the government yet go and serve. Even the most recent legislation is designed to encourage development and without equity participation of the tribe's toxic legacy left by fueling uranium development has had devastating impacts in indigenous governments with uranium resources or opposed new mining developments is amoral and untenable, and nations are presented with a false choice of developed looting energy versus that remain in dire poverty, and as a result, indigenous nations are the most impoverished and suffer most in the country. Let's go in 9 nations are the poorest in the country. The unemployment rate is more than twice the national rate. The housing rate is the poverty rate is 26%, 14% are without electricity, 10 times the national rate. Electricity distribution systems are vulnerable to extended outages. The fuel assistance programs do nothing, and this affects over 5 million people in the U.S. alone. U.S. Census Bureau and 12.1 million people. The population of American Indians and Alaska Natives, and lack of economic autonomy. Opportunity, breed, dependence, and causes indigenous extinction. That's Alwat in 3. The greatest threat to long-term survival of our culture is the passive economic welfare condition. Dependency is breaking down our social fabric. Cultural survival therefore makes economic development urgent and necessary, and U.S. control over indigenous resources guises constitutes biopolitical control over life and the death of indigenous populations under the guise of benevolent humanitarianism. Solar and wind energy and indigenous lands makes visible the regulatory operations of the state. That's Powell and 6. The power of the state to make, live, and let die exerts its force over population development. Programs are to reveal the schemes to control. So populations are defined as problems and opportunities. The populations have been exterminated but removed under the guise of patrimony. Under carrying of the history of development is a biopolitical operation to manage life of indigenous peoples in America. So see the regulatory operations of the state framed as a treaty responsibility. It provides a way of understanding the history of structure-driven development models as a way of regime for controlling and organizing particular bodies and environments. Wind and solar projects on reservations or counter projects of biopower models of development. And biopolitics culminates in nuclear annihilation and extinction. That's Foucault and 78. Wars are waged on behalf of the existence of everyone as managers of life. Regimes have been able to wage many wars. The situation is the endpoint of the power to express a whole population to death. The underside of the power to guarantee an individual's continued existence. If genocide is the dream of modern powers, it's because powers exercised at the level of life, the species, the race, and the population. And making visible the operations of biopower causes societal transformation. The plan is a necessary reform to initiate that process. That's Foucault. In 88, once this came forward against the government of this work, you must be arrested. Reforms that cannot be produced in thin air. Critique is a matter of pointing out the practices that we accept. The thought is hidden and animates everyday behavior to show that things are not self-evident and what is acceptable will no longer be accepted as such. One can see no longer thought of things, think of things as no longer formally thought of. Transformation becomes very urgent and quite possible. And integration of thought and transformation is enough for people to carry them out, making complex more visible. New power relations must emerge, and first temporary expression will be reformed, and alternate strategies can intervene in the histories of domination and exploitation and challenging imperial center. That's Murphy and Six. By implementing alternative strategies and supplying indigenous perspective and necessary for cultural translation, the American history is revived, creating a symbol of anti-colonial resistance. It educates while it subverts. The assumption of the imperial-centric cultural translation helps shift away the points of opposing cultural translation, communicates not with its own people, with white America as well, and becomes a place where hybridity can exist in thought of redemptive sense and empowering space in which cultural translation may operate. And renewable energy development is the next support for self-determination. That's Arizona Law Review 10, and ability to develop renewable energy encompasses notions of indigenous growth and self-sufficiency, representing a shift away from federal control, and indigenous ownership or investment in renewables is necessary to prevent leakage and spur reinvestments. As Mishwish and 10, there's a recurring theme of resources extracted with no economic gain for the opportunity of the community. The process of exploiting the resources in indigenous lands and significant similarities to third world colonialism. Resources are taken for the royalty payment, deemed fair. The value added was skewed towards the off-reservation economy. The end result has been a mistrust of passive deals with extracted resources and don't include direct involvement of the tribes as investors or owners and fail to reinvest. And the option of indigenous ownership enables self-determination, active control over projects, ensures that they reflect indigenous priorities economically and otherwise. It's worser. And 12, indigenous tribes take an active role in the government and any joint venture, operating production service, and managerial, any other agreement, and non-Indian company tribes may choose the business role that best suits their needs. The back middle ground, the partnerships, and non-Indian energy companies is crucial. Partners tribes with a partnership retain only a more significant role in the project itself will realize greater revenues, increase professional opportunities for tribal members, and the ability to make a management team with long-term stake in the community, and preventing leakage creates a multiplier effect, spurring development. That Djokovic and Levin, known as leakage in Indian countries, able to keep with capital because they buy non-Indian goods and services. Energy is not an exception. Solar on reservation keeps money in Indian country available for development in other areas, preventing leakage. Tribes have enough time being educated and talented individuals because there's no way to deploy their expertise. High-trained individuals in Indian country are likely appropriate for investment in tribal business and homes and modernization of reservation infrastructure is likely to occur in solar. And manufacturing company learned to land is to be a sustainable industry, giving educated Indians a reason to come home. And solvency. Government control as a decision-maker destroys any chance of solvency. Indigenous decision-making is key to economic development. That's Royce through 8. More important than practical sovereignty is more important than political sovereignty is practical sovereignty. Practical sovereignty puts development in indigenous lands and matters decisions. The consequences. Cornell calls it that after 15 years of research, you can't find a single case of sustained economic development in which an entity other than the nation is the sovereign. It's a necessary condition. Decision-making is a default mode of development, but that does not work. Federal control over economic decision-making is the core problem, and advocacy with respect to government recognition of self-determination has a reparative effect, acknowledging injustice and personhood establishes a policy template built around commitment to injustice that addresses serial policy failure. That's Sosi 7. According to Matsuo, reparations recognize the personhood of victims. The lack of redress for racist acts continues the injury by signifying non-personhood victims. Reparation declares you exist, the nation and the laws acknowledge you. The reparations must involve recognition of indigenous peoples. The political right to self-determination is a process of collective acknowledgement that helps educate us and helps to report of repeating the same error. The apology is intended to inspire apologies template with legal and political redress for past wrongs, reflecting current needs of human harms. Some are too complex for a quick fix. Healing will require federal and moral as well as legal commitment to self-determination. What does it mean to support autonomy if the majority of the population lacks the material resources to be autonomous? And if there are a significant portion are incarcerated in poverty, torn apart by substance abuse and domestic violence, these are the paradoxes of contemporary policy. And 83 nations can do solar now. That's Economic Review 12. Solar energy can be readily implemented. Sufficient isolation is available on 83 reservations, and 770 can do it now. But Session 1 for Federation in 10.
All right. Do you defend implemental instrumentation of the plan?
I'm sorry?
Can you claim offenses off the rhetoric if you're wanting to see external to your ability to solve through the plan text?
Are you referring to our ability, our reference of indigenous peoples as indigenous peoples and not as American Indians?
No, I'm not. That's not what I'm claiming. Like, can you access external offense to just you speaking the 1AC?
Sure.
Separate from your ability to solve?
Our argument is that an advocacy against colonialism is desirable in and of itself.
Also, that advocacy for including marginalized populations in decision-making sets a positive method for future policies.
Okay, when has this ever been true? We've done both of those things, and your inherency seems to take out those two
We
solvency
haven't
claims.
done any of those things.
Yes, we
because it
talked about
hasn't
natives
completely
before,
done
we
that.
brought them into the discussion,
Okay,
and
we've talked about
we
natives
picked up
before,
half
we brought
rounds
them
for
into
sure.
the discussion. It's a question about the meaningfulness of this discussion. Our argument is that it hasn't been meaningful unless we've addressed these policy issues.
Right, I guess when you make 1AC claims that your Speech Act solves something, while in other rounds that you've won, has that not solved anything?
Our argument is not that the Speech Act is in and of itself sufficient. Our argument is that our advocacy is desirable, that we should take a stance against
Okay.
colonialism. It's not
Yeah,
something that stops at any round. It's something that's persistent.
All right, that's fine. And then I guess, why would the embracement, what is unique to the embracement of solar and wind as to why that's like some counter-hegemonic project that your Powell evidence is
Sure.
doing?
Our evidence indicates that indigenous peoples, well, fossil fuel and uranium mining, these traditional modes of energy in indigenous lands have traditionally been sites of colonization and corporate exploitation. Our argument is that renewable projects are much better. They comport much more readily with an indigenous sustainable ethic, and furthermore, our evidence indicates that it's implementable on all these lands. It's universally
I guess, why does
accessible.
that challenge hegemony? It's going to be, you're going to buy the technology from big Western companies. It's going to be leased from.
It's a question of whether or not these indigenous people
I don't
can
understand why wind and solar
create
are
business
different.
opportunities where they can funnel capital back into their nations.
So with any economic development, funnels capital back.
It also
No.
needs to be independent of government capacity to.
All right, so why don't
the
casinos solve
The
that?
choice is what enables them to sustain this development.
Right, but why don't
Furthermore,
casinos
renewables
solve
are
it?
unique because it facilitates a much better form of economic development that other forms don't access.
Why would casinos not access those?
Because they don't create sustainable development or development or
Las
solve-
Vegas, Atlantic City?
Our evidence
How
also
are they not?
indicates that brain drain is problematic. We have to keep
How do you
science-oriented
solve brain
people on
drain?
our lands, because if there are indigenous renewable energy projects, then indigenous scientists will stay on indigenous lands and consult about energy projects.
Okay, so, all right, I guess I really just don't understand why this like wind and solar is key thing. Like, how does this overcome all the other instances of U.S. sovereignty over native lands? And why are these technologies so special?
Our evidence indicates that energy policy is a unique site for alternative
Why?
strategies in
Which
targeting
ones?
biopower. The reason why it's key is because of the history of resource exploitation.
It's let me know when you're both ready. What is it called?
One and see something.
What in CR3? First off, it's TR interpretation of restriction must mandate decrease in quantity produces analogy in the United States to the United States are utilitarian restricted, effectively restricted, domestic production, prevention, controls, and restricted quantities permitted to produce systems of regulation, production, not a restriction, production, replace the word restrict with regulatory and defeated requires reduction of production of plain chase regulation, how energy is produced, not restriction, how much or where it's produced, that kills limits is Dove and 76% of comprehensive study of the order to determine the best way to organize energy related regulatory activities of government for agencies to be involved in making regulatory and energy 40 could significantly affect the ability to cost energy standard oil company must file about 1,000 reports per year for the different federal agencies and refer interpretation particular limits are prerequisite education that says controls the debate of negative research and ability to compete within the round and Brightland their interpretation cries and you look at the intent or effects of regulation rather than the words or interpretation as a Brightland the words of the law data limit energy reduction is top remove they skirt for distinction within the literature based security and education based off they provide is based off base and relevant to discussion of restrictions topic that is voter next off is counterplan tax 50 states should create and enter into a compact and the requirement and the requirement that indigenous nations in the United States enter to a tribal energy resource agreement prior to forming non-leasing business agreements or solar and wind project and complex investing interstate energy action and police federal preemptions creating energy conflict customer will require a commonwealth energy program officers programs like installation of constitutional advanced renewable energy program multi-renewable operation federal preemption next off the DSCIR will pass down the overall subs but overall numbers with delay works bills burden and a little some 320 there's both parties with confidence immigration giving momentum giving told banner we're close to the momentum coincide so setbacks for Obama can control major deficit reduction the process moving forward quickly in both the House and the Senate in time first further we get away the lesser we see and leave of success of progress achieved by being a big factor in when and how the House group releases proposed Senate coalition open and introduced legislation in April. Plan is unpopular across congressional fights. That's Congress 12 Congress maybe want to relinquish federal consideration development with an Indian country proposal for reform may prove to be unacceptable to Congress to be a statement of federal government likely address many of the concerns of Sierra. It's key the economy's riders 129 use kind of led of Obama CEDA the overhaul of immigration laws immigration to encourage to reduce ship race tax revenues and help reduce budget deficit immigration helps drive innovation an additional boost to growth and compromising rising immigration opportunities from still workers from rather than expand affairs for a step legal immigration law and issue or overcome the shortages harsh regulation more increased financial incentives burdens on business the current system does not work for anyone. Economic client causes war this royal intent. Acronym plan may increase the conflict shocks that should interview should be relevant leads miscalculation expectation trade to uptrade fine conflict increase that states will be used to states will use force against industries to bring has been sharp relations between internalized conflict during academic doctrine decline has been linked with terrorism which will across borders getting governments have increased incentives for fabricating military conflicts for stability and for defense will with decrease in conflict US but do not consider this definition created by academic crisis. Next off is the K. The discourse of sovereignty ensures indigenous political failure and hegemonic state success and institutions are rigged against indigenous communities that deploy the language of sovereignty attempts to productive change must rethink move beyond sovereignty as Alfred and one main obstacle to achieving peaceful coexistence is the uncritical settlement constitutional sovereignty favorable discussion of political relations between people's discourse sovereignty expecting to any potential resolution issues of respect and national values and preserve for sex child traditions peoples and building a perfect post-colonial governing system is to disconnect the notion of sovereignty from the left and legal reason transformation of the current generation of indigenous politics zero some context comparison with non-indigenous politicians do the search of sovereign rights for indigenous peoples not really believe in it comes to transparent bargaining play and relevant and lever for concession within the established constitutional framework of the major problems leaders most qualified rationalists goals by modifying sovereignty cause of non-indigenous politics trying to get higher weakness in their church sovereign right for peoples who know how the culture frame the institution capability capacity to defend or state initial act of asserting sovereign right for indigenous peoples to destroy how structured politics decolonization sense of the state has the use the original consistent positions on the advantage of the fundamental question the assumption that our land states provide first prior to that assumption colonialism to structure the relation of progress towards achieving just and indigenous perspective made within this framework of marginal and the alternative is to reject their call U.S. sovereignty rejection of the language and discourse of sovereignty scored over confronting the ongoing and everyday violence against indigenous communities failure to reject and ensures indigenous exploitation as Alfred and one. Indigenous people have success being engaged Western and Western second for state movement to restore the autonomous power and cultural integrity in the area. Governance movement is founded on rejection models of government rooted in European culture values many communities have almost into themselves paternalistic state control. Paternalistic controls is every transcend the colonial mentality movement society the structures of dominance more than can have equal to realities which are tracking those large from the question of people's political rights and status in relation to states the colonial system itself has become embedded within indigenous societies that its fundamental position in each political place indigenous communities. Next is partial leadership who transcend the mentality that supports the colonialization of indigenous beginning with the rejection of the term the notion of indigenous sovereignty. Next up is the counterplan text. United States federal government and the requirement that indigenous nation the United States should enter into a tribal energy resource agreement prior to forming non-leasing business agreements for solar projects. There are 266 lobbying cranes now. It's AP&A, the variation person under 266 thanks to conservation efforts. They'll crash into wind turbines. AP&A way about lobbying cranes again be at a risk of crashing into wind turbine when turbine transits lands or because of how lost to the wind farms. Their key to biodiversity which prevents extinction of operation migration. They have the reason to worry about lobbying cranes specifically. There are keystone species in state lobbying cranes. There are at least 50 species as well to joke about that. There is human need. Next, that wind power interface with duty rate at the chest terrorism is Daniel 10 increasing wind turbines staying in total radar signal to use track rating aircraft regulation administration filed an objection proposed wind farm North Central Oregon which of the wind turbines were sorting the turbines were going to disrupt radar as much as 20% of the time giving false positive readings and that caused extinction of species and six areas groups provide nuclear weapon by number of massive successfully employed a nuclear weapon will be devastating municipal depression next to the cause they discover the pressures and how nuclear weapons massive increasing numbers concentrating at full scale nuclear confidence with the use of nuclear weapons and wind is key to China's economy is Gambia and 12 China's economy can support wind power will also be essential in international to grow rapidly China's low carbon pathways while it could have major impact on global development cost protection key low carbon technology Chinese economy collapsed since World War III straight times since China disintegrated because the economy collapsed and not even try to pay off the refugees and you might make a grab for defending say hello to World War III and wind fails this way and aids much wind power is currently being produced in Minnesota's overload regional grid problem curtailment cycle transmission lines will go back to grid block the blades from massive determining still another complicated queuing issue good case. There are hundreds of alternative causes to the case industrialization, extraction, oil buying, building hydropower dams, and clearing forests that are destroying indigenous ways of life, and uranium mining has devastated cultural survival and util first community 96 and regrets and huge dignity kind of way. Well, I can't wait to list just unjustify the deontological chase by the return and go any reason connected to so homicide philosophy with the last two is not a way by one that was not destroyed each price I had the reason to take as many as possible. And there's no impact of poverty that's hidden and poking in 2K or and rights hostility and aggression. So some conflict often present between groups who are concerned with the factors that make make such complex as for the basis of individual precedents are different from all plans present, but in a large war crisis also always has multiple costs, and you can't prevent things like rape and native women. There are other bills and laws to guarantee that their impact claims happen. Democracy checks, biopower mechanisms taken into account, construction, social practice, social knowledge will lead to not experience Nazi policy dynamic of Nazi the pros, pragmatic set ideas of political structure like that could realize the disaster potential of the ideas of biology shaped by totalitarian conception and social management focus on power and ubiquity of the same democratic studies biological story being streamed by rights-based study of strategy, social management. Biopower operates to sustain life, not kill, rejecting creates more atrocities. That's OJ Congress 75. The effectiveness of biopower can be seen like precisely that overclings from the trials for even every demand of killing power, responsibility power over bare life to sake, but pure power for life to sake living is the conditional life there's not been and will not be completed by a political society. And their engagement with the others, parasitic and consumptive, naturalizing active colonialism and oppression turns cases Chow 93, the Malice in terms of third world's fancy culture, who was a social order opposed to the one that is supporting her own undertaking. What she wants is located the other, and locating the other resulting in identification with the malrealization, the other's deprivation, mass tragedy becomes a rhetorical renunciation. Material power that oppresses that, material power that enables her to write the master retains passion, term, powerlessness, truth, and intolerance of those who think through the amounts of pleasant use for fulfilling ideals of the master turns the others into the subject of her study of generations of alternate use to flogging equally generally aspects of the representation of the other ignores the power relation structuring the mouse in Korean which notion of lack of domestic so for George Jonathan and determining the intention of spelling speakers on sensibility and political rights and whether sincere delusion. I'll take the route of assured means with wording power intellectuals are robbing the terms of oppression, the critical important finding the oppression the vocabulary protest rifle in their use of the term Holocaust and the jail evidence races and turns cases GOM and United Holocaust tolerate transcription of the Holocaust and Holocaust and semantic term history the term is Christian term Holocaust indicates the sacrifice of the Hebrews of the church fathers to determine literal sensible as a plan of against the Jews to condemn the uses of bloody sacrifice of Holocaust and extended as a metaphor to include Christian martyrs such that their tortures equated with sacrifice of the cross is defined as a Holocaust is the semantic creation of Holocaust vernacular language requires the meaning of the sacrifice of severe devotion sacred and severe motives is repeated over and over again. The terms used in polemics against the Jews has history. First one, versus Holocaust work from the massacre of Jews and finally anti-Semitic fashion virtue. Jews had them testified they began to burn the Jews for the problem even the celebration lasts as long as the Holocaust cannot be completed with the next name to other cities and the cities imitate the southern bloodsuckers hell formation of using this always involved in the case where they may have think it is intolerably tend to establish connection to Auschwitz and the complete devotion of sacred spirit, but it cannot sound like a Jackson language as a term implying unacceptable equation between crematoria and altars, but also to use a semantic variety that is from its inception anti-Semitic, reducing the EIS requirements to self-determination claims as ratchery in 12 faster classes favoring new larger parts of lower guard class and regular tax assault and irreparable harm.
Is that second counterpoint only pick with biodiv and China like market design?
You got it.
Yeah, there was one other thing. Terrorism was the second episode.
Okay, DoD first.
Yeah.
The plan eliminates the restriction and reduces the amount of coal and fossil fuel and uranium development on indigenous lands. How is this not a reduction?
What?
You don't do that. Right,
Okay,
like you
where-
eliminate the
Sure,
requirement.
Sure. So if there's a shift away from these older forms that are reduced into these new forms, how are we not a
I gotcha.
reduction of this type of an
Uh,
interpretation?
At the very worst, that means first of all, at the very worst, that means your extra
That doesn't determine topicality at all.
Okay.
Moving energy from one sector to another does not mean you are topical.
Okay, but your evidence doesn't talk about a shift. It just says that
Right,
one
the
form
shift
of
has
energy
nothing to do
needs to
with
be reduced,
topicality.
right?
You
Our
must-
argument is that one form of energy is reduced. How do we not meet your interpretation?
No, it's not. No, it's not that energy has to be reduced. That is not our argument. Our argument is that you are a regulation, not a restriction.
Sure. Okay. How are we a regulation and not a restriction?
Because a regulation is simply a requirement that you have to meet before you can produce.
Okay, if we eliminate a regulation, how is that not a removal of a restriction?
Right, because that's our argument, is that there's a difference between, when it comes to production, a restriction on production is something that that says that there is a quota on the amount that you can produce, or that there is a specific area where you may not produce it. Not just there are conditions upon which you must meet before you produce them.
Okay, sure.
Your interpretation would allow things like lowering minimum wage.
That's okay, that's fine. Your correct evidence, your solvency advocate for your state's counterplan indicates that a compact solves, however, talks about other policies where it might be applicable. Indigenous energy development is under the sole jurisdiction of the BIA. How can the state compact solve for this?
Yeah, it talks about how any kind of state compact
No, it
is
says that
necessary.
it can be regulated in interstate commerce in private matters. If this is only regulated by the BIA, it seems as a quasi-public matter. How can we regulate it?
Right, our evidence indicates that in terms of energy policy, that a state's compact is necessary. That it's the best way to do it
Okay,
and
that's fine,
shield from
right,
the
but do you
normal
have
operation of
any
federal
solvency
preemption.
evidence indicating that the state compact is capable of accessing indigenous energy development?
Yes,
you
I
made
think
the
this
point.
Craig evidence indicates that.
Where?
It indicates that it solves all kinds of federal energy
Okay, it
issues,
says
which would
interstate-
necessarily include
it
your
says
affirmative.
it can be covered under the Commerce Clause for
I mean, I'm going to tell you the same
development.
thing again. I think that it solves your affirmative
Okay,
because it talks about all kinds
does
of
your
federal
Craig
energy.
evidence specifically say anything about indigenous? Does
No,
say
it does not
indigenous or
specifically
native
talk about
American?
Just like
That's
you're not going to
fine.
read a piece of
That's
compact evidence
okay.
that
Let's
you
talk about your sovereignty, Kay. What is sovereignty?
Sure. In the context of the affirmative, you define sovereignty as the ability for a government to control its
Where do
people.
we define sovereignty like that?
I would argue that in the 1AC, the idea that like they're going to be sovereign because they can make the decisions about what types of
Okay.
energy they get to
Sure.
develop.
What is? Do you
And
think
it's
that
more
there's
of a
a
criticism of
Our
the discourse.
1AC talks about self-determination, about economic empowerment. What's the distinction between sovereignty and self-determination?
I guess we don't isolate one in the 1AC.
Okay, fair. What does the alternative look like in rejecting this discourse?
Right,
Like, what
sure.
would it look like in terms of policy?
If you
you
kind of
don't
like
have to answer that.
Maybe I'll take a crack.
Yeah.
Jill, start it.
Yep.
Sorry, I just had to.
No, that was good. I have no idea what was going on.
Restrictions or limitation on the use of property, Supreme Court of Texas 10. Restrictions defined upon use to mean a limitation placing the use of limited property. 2, contextually, limitations or add-on access. All restrictions, US DOI, DOA, and DOE 8. This also trace in our true back to the direct access to oil and gas factor 1. Whether lands are open or closed leasing, i.e. acceptable or inacceptable. 2, the degree of access afforded. And all the lands, some leasable lands may in fact be imposed. Notably, all leases are subject to trace government statute or legal requirements legally to for purposes of creating environmental, historical, cultural values. The trades include access restrictions for associated with oil and gas leasing. Restrictions are the equivalent of conditions on the action. Plumber 29. The word restricted when using connection with property is considered to be the legal equivalent condition. The other may be termed an eliminated limitation of the unqualified government state condition. Restrictions are that which limits or modifies the basic character of something. A restriction of qualification, restriction of limitation, modifier, control the agent contact which is connected or the requirements and non-purpose of connect, plan reduces restrictions on production, legal from 9, under policy to expand production to restricted areas and no limits distinction, no way distinction over however a ban snaps that restrict property and include chance and prohibition and we effectively lift and 12 branch references in 1, commercially allowed, no nations of under terror, and there's a clear bright line and substantial checks and they kill topic meaning because there are no direct federal prohibitions on when the sole only meaning of topic meaning to every word in topic. Our solution language the only non-arbitrary to determine case limits and case overview. 1, empower, use your about to massively mass part destroys the existence of indigenous peoples, enables economic opportunity, self-determination, future with key practical sovereignty. 2, revalue and repair, honor, carry, or demonstrate denial of decision-making control over energy, flex the objectification of indigenous and other populations by the United States government that compensates determination around the globe, endorse the method of the affirmative by associate that ensures future decision-makers to include marginalized population interest in decision-making, commits to reparations, rectifying the hearts of this set of solving other replication, voting negative commits to decision-making that has and will continue to reduce war and genocide. 3, successful indigenous energy development, the ongoing extermination of 9 million indigenous peoples under the guise of commit terrorism, neutral terrorists with the same biopolitical operation to produce Hiroshima, produce extinction, indigenous and solar, solve act as countermodels that unveil the regulatory options of the state necessitate change and voting absent dedication to anti-colonial and anti-genocide on body absent just by the plan action includes that decision method and thought vote to ground politics and new ethics and another justice still in 99. Models differ according to the rules defined as who to just and who's empowered. I go to make the execute determine the law rules established who loves the community, but shall establish a religious and ethical commitment they inaugurate that each jurisdiction or showing eradication those belief the law does not merely reflect decision of grounds, but instead of having individuals to make what ends and personally need voted all balance but has through thought, not religious and hand on the way I think the other now which is historically ungoverned, not just the determination of the human. They see how causal plan solves league interest key to breed by just a cause key to solve practical sovereignty because it enables control over the population over the actual economic decisions and the livelihoods of the people there. So indicates that autonomy is meaningless without actually control or economic development, and they say they commit keys to abstract these situations. They're no way connected to the real world in the case where we cannot specifically identify clearly between allowing indigenous decision making and nuclear war. You should default to engaging in anti-colonial struggles. And they say Dickinson, but 1, the entire history of indigenous determination disproves this argument. The entire population of 98 million people have been exterminated, alienated, and impoverished under supposed democratic rights constrained state. 2, Israel displacing of Palestinians, the South African apartheid, and the bomb drop to Hiroshima and Nagasaki proved democratic structures do not check biopolitical man extermination of populations. And they make war impact argument. They say poverty, but structural violence the proximate cause of all wars, create tribing the psychologically structures escalation, trap who's in Peru off war, violence for parental suffering and death, political violence to a surface and pathological class race, violence continue both solid all wars, just conduct of social space, these aggressive death, the all comes really every concept of places, family, screen contact, war, essential levy archives, otherwise good humans and versus those trying to coordinate every day because one's right of participation, just like possible humanization, normalized structures, behavior, violence, the last of 7 is less than fully even prerequisite genocide, and on certain increased time that seems to tell us intelligent by outbreaks of mass violence, everyday violence and common scrutinized, high and inherited, those are political formations, and they say, They say we can't prevent rape, but economic self-determination is key to allowing a reparation system policy template that ensures that the future policies will be beneficial towards indigenous people. They say biopower sustains life and answer the Dickens vote. They say engagement with other causes parasites consumption versus talking solely about Maoists. Second, we don't pretend to be indigenous populations of York alongside men advocate for and against colonialism. They say Holocaust turns case, but one, we apologize for the offensive in relation to the Holocaust. Second, we're not talking specifically about the Holocaust. We're talking about destruction as in the word Holocaust, not the event itself, which means we're not relating to the anti-Semitism they're fearing. They say reducing the requirement kills self-determination, but history proves that the EAS requirement ensures that the government is able to control whether or not indigenous people develop energy. The fact that there have been there's only one commercially viable renewable project shows that the EAS requirement is what is harmful and not beneficial. Now on the wind pick, their evidence of urban craters as a keystone species only implicates 50 other species being destroyed. No argument. Overall spillover extinction. At worst, some species die. Ecosystem resilient. 77 can do wind now. National Wildlife Federation 10. Landscape hydrogen wind power center revival based economies in. They see the radar evidence about needing radar in other countries and increasing use of wind turbines elsewhere. But only increase in the U.S. Their extinction impact and preventing herds by targeting at the source. The evidence in the context keeping track of Russia during the Cold War. This will all be international tracking. The U.S. disruption would not harm the scenario. Also, their scenario is terrible. No link between false positive radar, nuclear weapons execution by terrorist groups, and wind fails specifically to Minnesota. Also, there's no evidence U.S. and China are competing in the wind market, which means that indigenous wind access would not cause the effects they're talking about. Also, there's no reverse causal claims in any of their direct. Don't give their awful impacts and perm to both their regional weather variation. Descendants for both types of energy. August 10. Respect the West Peninsula have the most direct variation. No plans can exceed wind international plan. Maximize self-determination allows indigenous people to choose which multi best for them. The CEDA dictates to indigenous people seem that they can't act. Choice is key. And National Wildlife Federation's and 7 years operation support wind energy now. Kaplan ensures continuation of colonialism on at least 77 reservations now and more in the future. Now in the state's counterplan first. Regulation interstate commerce is the VA is quasi-public means that they have no solvency. Have the case they aren't able to solve for because indigenous peoples fall under congressional jurisdiction, which means that the states aren't able to act on it. Also, they have no solvency advocates voter because there's an infinite literature race that we have to do if they can just act or also perm do both, and it doesn't solve reparations because individual state recognition doesn't address continued government devaluation of populations or change federal government policy towards others. Also, lack of reparations ensures error replication government re-implement anti-indigenous policies to the state do anything. Also, doesn't solve self-determination because federal policies remain in effect, blocking solvency. Now onto the Alfred. Turn on indicates economic development is needed for indigenous survival. If the is necessary stimulus needed is prerequisite to enable anything sovereignty and society answered on how to deal if we live in empowerment and permanent the plan rejects sovereignty discourse engaging legal system for survival is necessary. One distinction, there's a distinction with the gift argument first. U.S. starts paying unrepayable debt to indigenous via the plan, not giving a gift and establishes a pattern for future policies that design to achieve this. Second, the plan removes the gift for protection from corporate exploitation. 3, the plan is a negative action which it doesn't link plan term and term strategic essential historically continued use of indigenous identity sovereignty is necessary to political obliteration of freedom achieved by destabilizing identity live intrinsic significance. Log up 94, leave for condition identities, connection to referencing legal system which serves, for example, the religion is political argument, stability, and the order, like the land, the rest of the people do maintain that the main represent the legal framework. Sovereignty is a national right, not a bad factor. Indigenous people's right to sue neighbors, sovereignty has not refused British policies if we could. The just remember the sovereign feel the power, not honor identities, and never erasing indigenous people's concerns and deal with it. But they were our heart to the 100 imposing sovereignty was still teaching destruct pieces to make that nation possible. Sovereignty is a communal contract. It is necessary to prove that in regards for time being there must be a strategic nationality, not no identity at all. Indigenous people remain cultural artifacts or race free in the margin limited in pattern study. Solvency and Murphy indicate the plan system policy for future reparations and foster an issue with dialogue and understanding self future government policy and indigenous demands for equality. Shatter the identical independence of the indigenous peoples who are exploited because of the income of their cultural authority considering the system G8. When you respect land based water rescue class privilege, white poverty, code qualifications like exclusive habits, about Malcolm disregard the civil demands. She refinds your grounds to support the not to disregard the implicit law of civil law against law as the saints inscribed in religious discarding the system still enables the not to erase circle 2 with the wishes of birth in the hand. Is while the indigenous wants to become an integrating part of society and a little undertaking for the issues of our pronouncing its culture and a spent through the whole British much threatening consistent apparently radical rejection of the ground of social strategy perm new plan and rejecting all their instances and politics. While telling it was over policy leaders shifting on Chinese street restrictions to Washington Post to reach money. While there was the question of money because negative impact of all the new scene and showing shop approval rating below 50% national reach from the worst. The concept of the Donald discussion is much as negative dinner drone taxes and dinner from my house and chat the electric page problems and persist. Obama's honeymoon may well have ended and Obama priorities and promise putting bids into labor of stalled immigration political what 321 do. These anything of aid and property talent level is LA by being big letter weakness. Those are recession and 39 think he did other pursue the test of the Bishop Group box. There are more times than no work in progress and how that proves popular. By unanimously reduced restrictions turned by partisan trade, the plan generates bipartisan good when they call both parties have ideological reasons to support it. Jones 11. We want to use word of over the back power to where religion about digital and segregation major sense that decisively enthusiastic there was one renewable energy event is hard to hold the taker blocks the large tradition of United for create jobs investment and unrelated opportunity to reduce federal bureaucracy and LHD potential lineage energy they come together party lines of economic recovery and beat poverty and goodwill is key to resolving disputes over the budget AP 11 first the economy survival goodwill of return after recently feared vice which included that ceiling and the GB sports plan Hastings 11 unfit matter gave the the option of an engine loans but yet Bowman virgin part of a major component of the agenda and Congress increasing use energy the priority about the majority industry on the very important place in their link evidence just says that it may removing environmental arguments where you may be unpopular with Congress, take no definitive stance, which you refer our evidence, which is citing people who actually support the plan of the status quo. Also, there's no link, no funding is no link, and Harthack has unanimously proves popular direction actually to the Harthack, the Senate has to be unanimous consent, the Hearts Exchange Act, initially thrown land, no funding, no link, bottom of the docket, but only means the land would be behind the Senate, excessively heavily resistant to ideological terms, both the plan before Congress members vote based on predispositions, bond inflation 90. Steiner presents of an idea of the World Congress voting decision, killing their votes, also matters, so that most members coming with all border free persuasion, the relatively can in their minds and impacts on apology when they see solves accounting for marginalized populations, ensure that we don't go to nuclear war and engage in actions that could harm them because we don't just value our population over others. Only biopolitics, which is what makes extinction possible, and the plan is the only mechanism that they will solve for these types of things in status quo. Also, the fact that we had an economic recession proves that the impact is non-unique. Also, our critics said Copeland indicates that there's always a utilitarian justification for ignoring the interests of indigenous status quo. There's no reason why also there's no solvency for immigration or for the economy because it would be a huge time frame. There's no immediate turn like the economy, which you prefer long-term solvency and executive actions which are able to solve.
What was the first argument? Politics, immigration.
That he doesn't have any political capital.
Was it like Aswani or something? Or?
It's Washington Post.
That's right.
Sorry, thank you.
Okay. I want to start with case. How do you solve these alternative causes?
Because our argument is the main cause of all of this deprivation is the lack of economic development. The plan spurs indigenous ownership over renewable energy, which provides revenue that allows for reinvestment in the local economy and also...
So wait, the only way, okay, so the main way for indigenous populations to get self-determination is to have economic development.
No, they also have to be able to control that development. It can't just be
All right,
dependency on
control that
government.
development. All right, what do you do to stop like businesses from going in and controlling?
Because
The
there
neighbors.
the plan removes restrictions on non-leasing
All right,
arrangements. which
name
means
one
that
local community that owns its alternative energy projects.
the point is that they need to engage in joint
Right,
ventures.
the point is that none of them have the money to afford it
Because-
in the status quo
yes.
because they're super expensive, so that it gets owned by some outside interest.
No, the
How do
plan,
you solve for that?
the plan enables joint ventures, which allows for indigenous peoples to work with corporations, so they have an equity stake,
Okay.
and therefore
Sure.
control the means
All right.
of development. They
How
don't
do you
have to
stop other companies from building hydropower dams?
because
on
indigenous
mainland?
peoples they don't have to engage in these harmful other deals if they have
Right, but how do you
economic
stop companies from forcibly going in and doing it like they
Our
do
Go
in the status
evidence
quo?
indicates that indigenous peoples oppose the types of deals like hydropower dams, and they only engage in them because
Right,
they have
they
no...
oppose. You aren't telling me how your affirmative means they are able to stop companies
Because
from
they
doing
don't, the companies rely on acceptance from the tribes. If the tribes say no, they won't do it, and the tribes will say no because they have alternative economic opportunities through renewable energies.
Why does structural violence cause war?
Because it creates the psychological mechanisms, it normalizes us to processes that can then be applied on a larger scale in like terms of genocide and violence, because we devalue populations like the poor as unworthy of like welfare or these other things that enables us to devalue enemy populations when we go to war.
Okay, how does it cause like resource wars?
It is what creates the conditions that allow for things like resource wars. The idea that we need to
How does
compete.
structural violence mean that we lose resources?
No, it's the idea that we need to compete with an enemy population who is less than us over a scarce amount of resource rather than cooperate with them over that resource and dividing it.
Okay, I gotcha. I want to talk about the K. Wow. Oh yeah, why is strategic essentialism good?
Because in the status quo, indigenous peoples are economically depressed, they have the worst conditions in the country, absent self-sustaining local economies which are achieved by working through the existing sovereign structure, there will be no
Right,
indigenous
what
culture.
sovereign structure exists on these Native Americans' reservations?
Your argument is that we are working through the federal government structure. Our argument is that this is okay because it's necessary to achieve indigenous survival and therefore enable deconstructing the sovereignty later.
They say BIA, but you're overturning terror restrictions. That's a congressional act. It's implemented through the BIA. And if we can overturn congressional legislation, then we are going to be sufficient. We're going to be sufficient to solve the complex circumstances of federal legislation. Neighbor rates are 98 to circumstances of federal legislation. Not appear to be any obstacle. Complex just have to have the effect of federal law. The complex supersedes the federal act. Just any new federal law would, and even the plan of federal authority. Complex operated in 2009. The plan approval is not obtained. Act the complex challenge. Congress rights represent acquisition of state power. The federal government and Congress will roll it back. This 2009 the legislation was the same force to bring actual action to suppression Jews are questionable like the compact remain in place. Any such legislation must pass the gross cast and private cost of retail ownership certificate more difficult crimes. You pass a law avoiding interstate compact. They say no solvency have to power for whoever this is key to creativity and outstanding different types of competency medicines, and it's probably the only kind of that's competitive to get over. You can debate it, and they say, and it's also questions of sufficiency. It's also just a question of sufficiency. We just have to be able to demonstrate that the counterplan is possible, not necessarily. Yeah, we just have to demonstrate that it is possible. And then it's up to you to come up with the solvency test. And the politics of that operates as a solvency advocate because it exposes the opportunity cost of voting for the affirmative, not endorsing through the state action. And we'll see counterplans are good anyways. Our recommendation to the naked state interstate conflicts, but not simultaneously be on a separate action. Force conflicts predictable first. Source of restriction on energy production. This is hard. Our here in 1985 during the 1930s, predominantly began as a nationalist competing state oil and gas kind of precursor to contemporary energy conservation for the participation of all states involved in the production of gas and oil. And second is mariners taking off and off our active social climate leadership and this should be named after often theories, education, debates are hard to complicate as well. Chris, about energy threat, predicting the federalism, reference, and friction, everything. Over the choice of others, for some more look at this very political, I will look into the choice of form, and it seems to be determined the outcome of conflicts. These are geometry that highlights the extent of which the proliferation threats the debate about the energy transition become increasingly stable. They say it's not reciprocal, but however you use it, you are beyond multiple actions by the United States federal government. They say it means it's about the same. They say no opportunity cost. Yes, there is. You can position yourself as an advocate, and you must choose between whether or not you advocate for legislation at the federal or state level. Means that's probably not an opportunity cost. You say it's utopian. No, it's not. You're just as utopian. Our understanding of evidence indicates that the 50 state complex is performing that is good. They say process focus is bad. However, this argument doesn't make any sense. Literally, this is just them trying to say that we have to say native paternalism is good. This is a dumb argument. If we are winning necessarily got benefit to our counterplan, that is reason why the education we are providing is good. Not for why the product is why the product is substantial enough for you to be or for the process of the product for you to be evaluating. We're not going for internal net benefits, which is probably what their evidence is talking about, and which is probably what their evidence is talking about. That's oh yeah, they say we don't solve reparations, but this doesn't make any sense. You're not going to be this doesn't make any sense. You're willing to being able to solve just the ability for them to have self-determination, generate enough wealth, and would also probably solve any sort of your model of arguments. It's the question of how the authority should be decentralized away from the federal government. Federal government to give local autonomy means that is probably the sufficient model to be able to solve. And lack of preparation to solve however this, or at least the replication. This is dumb argument. There one inherency evidence indicates that the United States federal government tried to take a good, positive gesture towards Native Americans, but it failed. No reason why they are. But then later we passed the terror restrictions. Proves that there is no proves that there is no spillover to future policy implications. Being I don't think we're going to be able to access the majority. There often some cases either go to decay. Traditional notions of sovereignty are inherently Western concepts. The idea that state or central authority being able to command specific modes of action is inherently Western notion. The attempts to associate land rights with political autonomy are also European concepts. These are incompatible traditional modes of native thinking. This is especially true in the context of power. But evidence which identifies the rights of the native being integral to indigenous extermination now, while power plans to win and sold are counter-hegemonic technologies and nothing that breaks Western notions of ownership or application values and become contingent upon material wealth. They also create managers within the populations who are necessarily in charge of dispersing the implementation of the electrical systems. And the first impact is co-option because the disconnect cultural politics and negative are also to defend their sovereignty within the framework of any events will be going back. And the second impact is genocide because the indigenous people are not only able to evaluate exist through Western modes of thinking, they were sovereignty has the power to eradicate individuals that challenge its interest, and the framework of sovereignty is more destructive than positive for indigenous communities. Indigenous policies that engage in discourse via sovereignty guarantees your policy failure and colonial violence before comparative evidence. Alfred Notes 2001. Many of the people who are self-belief to be making steady progress towards the resolution of injustice and colonization, but the people who question how the European term idea of sovereignty came to be so embedded in the important culture of the day, their own system of government belonging before the term sovereignty invented in Europe, the possible and be sovereignty in terms of mental affairs and physical and emotional health cannot be denied or understood. Yet this does not seem to be enough. The seriousness of the social success of the externality focus on assertion of sovereignty vis-a-vis of the state, not the conflicts, nor in the self-solution of the liberal leaders engaging themselves in the communities. The arguments are bringing within the liberal paradigm and not being able to protect the integrity of the nations, and the alternative direct to call for the United States sovereignty only when we begin outside the notion of Western sovereignty can indigenous politics truly form the permutation of possible discourse of indigenous sovereignty. Replicates internal colonization, imperialist violence, framing indigenous politics of resistance from within European sovereignty guarantees that continue exploitation. We must start from outside the framework of sovereignty in order to confront the colonialist relationship and European sovereignty indigenous communities is out from 2001. The discussion between sovereignty must be framed differently than the intellectual framework and internal conversation. The internal counterplay of the state sovereignty doctrines within the notion of dominion frames the discourse of indigenous sovereignty and broadcast of the world isn't been erased from the airport of fictions within a single sovereignty. This political post factual claim of European sovereignty is limited to many countries. First, the factual mere documentation of European assertion that economic autonomy does not necessitate and indicate proof that achievement of the discourse of autonomy upon which the current day post facto justification rests in European discourse, European assertion of both legal and political sense would make these European powers not be individually necessary to effect the law either politics, rights, and status, the people's sovereignty, the limited ways in which we are able to think, suggesting that the ways of conceptual definition problem to underground the calculation of indigenous people within a legitimate framework of settled evidence when we step outside this discourse, we confront the different problematic that the state sovereignty itself and the actual meaning of the contract, the fact, the political resistance the contract facts of potential exists for the nation to nation relations that they say permutation, but they say permutation with link arguments above reasons why the permutation is necessarily imply reasons why the permutation is possible. It was necessarily because the traditional notions of sovereignty will swamp any sort of ability to develop indigenous knowledge, just as weeds within a garden will prevent the flourishing of flowers. There's no way for us to actually develop or focus on these different modes of thinking when our own we are still stuck in the traditional ones that are employed by the one NC. They say, oh yeah, they say autonomy is useless as an economic development. This is a dumb argument when you especially consider the fact that Native Americans have never existed in a nation that had massive wind power turbines or solar panels. Proves that the traditional modes of thinking and self-determination are not contingent upon having dollars. This does not make any sense, specifically when they tell you about the context of how Americans necessarily have a positive relationship with land where they don't necessarily take as much out of it or not as consumers. Means that those are all reasons why they probably there are reasons why they probably don't need them, or they're centralizing beyond the point of them being able to garner solvency. They say that you need to solve for things like pattern studying. However, this doesn't make any sense. We've already done these. We've already done policies in the past meant to be reparations to Native Americans. That you cannot create a pattern setting effect. This is empirical. That means that you're not going to be able to access most of the offices. You say that you set up a permutation to plan into the alternative power. Yeah, there's no way for you to escape no way for you to escape the representation of 1AC. But it means no way for you to escape the representations of sovereignty within your 1AC. It means that they are necessarily forms of interpretation and reason why you should protect that makes the moving target means that I'm never going to be able to have a stable continuum 1AC strategy. Also undermines that argumentation development because it doesn't happen until 2 and C when they're done severing out of all the parts of the afterlife and necessarily generate links to go to the case flow. If it was true that these types of technologies had the ability to solve poverty, the United States would not have any poverty within the United States. This fundamentally does not make any sense. They say that there will be joint partnerships, but this argument is empirically denied. What happens is the companies come in and just lease the land and pay them the minimal amount of the money. There is no fundamental reason to why these technologies are deployed differently on Native American reservations. They are deployed throughout the United States. This does not make logical sense. You should probably reject powerfully worded but unwarranted articulations by their evidence. They will say things like wind power would totally be able to freaking solve, but perhaps an actual warrant development that there's no reason why that would be sufficient to solve for the entirety of things, or things like casinos would also be able to solve for the development of energy. If it's just a question of economic autonomy being sufficient for to be able to solve all the terminal impacts to the affirmative across our common 99 evidence, this is probably the reason why you're not going to be able to go for the majority of the impacts. After you say the way that indicates that necessarily the term Holocaust is a racist term. The idea that the Holocaust was a racist term. The idea that the Jews were sacrificing themselves to purge the Christian wrongdoers of any sort of to purge the Christian wrongdoers is a racist assumption upon which that type of language lies. Even if you say that you apologize for it, but you're still extending your piece of your Dylan evidence means that there's no reason way that you can be able to get it. And you also say that you don't talk about the Holocaust, but it's a question of the meaning of the word has necessarily changed, making it look like it isn't necessarily a sacrifice. I don't think it'll be able to access. Finally, extending the word also wrapped in 12 evidence. This serves as terminal defense to them being able to access any of their self-determination impacts in the case that when the economic development comes and it necessarily overrides previous cultural traditions within the Native American communities, proves that they're not going to have a positive impact on these communities. In case the DISs are the only thing stopping the development of wind turbines and burial grounds and stuff like that. Probably a reason to why you don't vote. Probably a reason why you don't vote affirmatively and endorse like allowing corporate fill-in. Or it's reasons to why there's Native Americans who don't want the corporations to allow the fill-in. It means that you are equally paternalistic to those individuals.
Okay, so I'm confused. If indigenous people ownership in the project, why would they build wind turbines on burial grounds?
Well, right, you set it up so that some people could build the turbines on the bigger grounds.
What evidence do you have speaking to this?
That's the piece of evidence. That's the Rafney evidence indicates that in the status quo, you remove the EIS requirements, those developments will happen on the Indian grounds. Or sacred Indian grounds.
You say that if tech can solve poverty, there'd be no poverty in the U.S. Do you read any evidence about the viability of wind and solar outside?
No, I don't, because it's just like outlandish claims with zero warrants. It doesn't make sense.
State's counterplan, you read this evidence from Davis and Brandon. It said, while states have never explicitly used the interstate compact, there appears to be no obstacles. Isn't this therefore just speculation that Congress might not roll it back?
Well, then it says, then the next card answers the rollback argument. It says, legislative inertia, the same force that typically
this seems to be advocating for replacement of the U.S. steel test. Do you have any evidence on what the U.S. steel test even is?
No, I mean...
Okay, then on the... the critique, could you define sovereignty again? I'm confused as to what we're enforcing here.
Right. You're enforcing this notion of sovereignty where the government gets to control its populations, tell them what they can do and what they can't do.
Isn't that the status quo?
Right, and you re-entrench it, and as long as you use those methods,
How do we
you will never be able to
re-entrench it?
overcome solvency. Sure. You define their ability to be free as their ability to control their local governments and their local developments, aka there are a few central planners who get to choose for the rest of the population.
Where do we advocate anything about central planners?
I think that's your 1NC evidence that indicates that we'll keep these smart people to be the project managers within our
Where does
communities.
it say that anywhere in the evidence?
I mean, I'll find it.
Okay, while you're doing that, do you have any evidence indicating that rejecting sovereignty would enable indigenous economic development or survival?
Yeah, our evidence, alternative evidence that we read in the 1NC says that this rejection opens up the ability that we have come as far as we can in terms of economic development and status quo until we reject the sovereignty discourse. Can we come up with new modes of thinking that allow for autonomy? It would probably be one that doesn't actually recognize the existence of the state
How
as
would
having
that
power
create economic
over
development
individuals.
that would allow indigenous people to not
Well,
be
sure. The
able to
reason that
power?
economic development is necessary now is that because we need to have money so that we can buy shit from other people that's regulated by a centralized authority.
Our argument is that we need to
We all
stop
existed
leakage,
before that
which is
stuff
where
happened.
they buy from off the reservation. If we build a sustainable economy, wouldn't that be addressing this argument?
They
you're
had
making?
sustainable economies without buying shit from each other or any of this stuff. This
So there
notion
can't
of
be any
capitalism
economic
is one entirely
Okay, so we're going
There's
no
no
market in the alternative.
right. Yeah,
How
that's how
do
they existed
indigenous
prior
people
to your
survive
intervention.
absent any interaction with the market? Do you interact with the market?
Me
Yeah.
in the status quo, in my real life or
Yes.
whatever. I don't think that matters.
Okay, then
I I probably
how
wrote it down
can
more
you
than I
point to any
supported.
examples of people who survive without market interaction in the U.S.?
Yeah, there are tons of people who live out in the wilderness.
Counterplan solves the entirety of the case. There was no 2AC solvency deficit, no new one-year arguments. They say the 77 tribes do win. There's no reason why solar doesn't necessarily solve the back of evidence. So somehow it just also doesn't have any warrant. Just as the natives can do wind energy, there's no necessary reason why that's key. Then they say permutation both that links to the net benefits. Also, the nexus to the counterplan causes worse pollination. There's no warrant to this explaining the 2AC or in the evidence or in the evidence with the counterplan solves that back. We still let natives have sovereignty just as well. The same way as the affirmative does. I think they also link to this limiting argument as well because you don't remove all USFT restriction on native lands. Native lands probably proves that you link to this too. Not of the net benefits for its Wobbin Crean says it outweighs biodiversity is key to checking. It's necessarily key to checking extinction. That should always come first because the only way that we can have any kind of values if we're alive also that destroys any kind of native culture. Which is the reason why it turns case they said that evidence talks about 50 species not extinction. Our impact evidence says that would be enough. They said other actors would be able to solve the back. That's not necessarily true. When retirements on the planet would be enough to destroy. Would be enough to destroy Wobbin Cranes and literally just run to them and die. Then the next is the terrorism net benefit. It leads to extinction. People literally free on just nuke each other. This probably leads to more kind of race and things. Means there can be no native determination. They say there are evidence about Minnesota. The evidence talking about a complaint in Minnesota would still apply to the affirmative any kind of DUD radar satellite throughout the entire country, which means the affirmative still triggers this. We're not going to go for the Chinese econ net benefit in the world where they can see that the counterplan solves the entirety of the case. You might as well put negative on the risk of any of our net benefits that way. Now go to the politics of CEDA inclines and controlling impact leads radical power to increase the risk of miscalculation, triggers solicitation, trade causes country fight practice war free to democratic states will fight diversionary wars that is royal. No economy means the plan is cancel the future which guts any kind of solvency. We access time for an equal cost out now needs to vote negative to short term back in classrooms. Their back is not possible the other way around. Also, you should save the human race a long amount of time. We always have a shot solving their impacts as long as we're alive. It also turns the case economic classrooms and natives are literally not able to make any money. It also means that companies violently take over native land in order to make money, which probably destroys any kind of sovereignty. That benefit that they get. It also prevents natives from doing things like solar and wind energy because they can't afford it, and because no private company would afford to work with them. That can incline to structural violence, exacerbates poverty, cause widespread mental trauma. WHO no longer probably hit hard with economic crisis, increase poverty crisis, increase housing number, and high debt processing, eviction crisis, increase in social exclusion of vulnerable groups, low income people, and people living in the poverty line. They expect extreme poverty include deficits in cognitive, emotional, physical development, cosmos, lifelong training, recession, social inequality, and health combined and market that are wide. And they say no PC. This evidence flips negative, says the wrong species. Fine, it proves that the probably triggers literally nothing wrong with no PC. They also mess up our scenario. Our evidence, our uniqueness evidence indicates that the gang of eight will get a deal on CIR and FCR now, but the app forces Congress shift focus from CIR, which means it won't pass. We don't solve the econ guarantees the impact. Also, the reason why none of their linked to an arguments are responsible. I'll get to that more when I get there. And then next, the uniqueness argument CIR will pass down most houses clinch together because folks is waiting from Trump, gun control, reduction time from April is Wednesday, Vermin, and Lilith and Will pass Senate House line of Republicans turn around, soon passes to citizenship, that's preference year, 319. Republican opposition to legalizing illegal immigrants, criminal lawmakers, criminal hall, running support among Hispanic voters, political climates, moderating Republicans are fighting first adopting the internet rights, essentially readily grouped in an asset. New Term Senate groups named to release proposals in the April and Congress questions bill not precise because the link was Washington Times to 2018 for a moment. By person to Congress state senators ability for immigration reform try to advance the general does which whether what the gang invade is doing on immigration reform. Now the link level Congress is plan they don't want to relinquish control over language control over native lands. That's calm. There's at least a delay. There's at least a delay that kills the bill, which kills the bill means we probably can't solve econ. We'll consider ideology outweighs, which they read at the bottom. That probably proves that the opposite of popular. All the evidence they read so the Republicans should like the plan, not that they necessarily do prove the status quo. Conservative conception against natives outweighs any kind of link turn. Next to the backwards link turn they read is only about the budget is not CIR, so it's not applicable to the dissent. Also, Congress posted native legislation, self-determination, Scalio in subcurriculum, ranking policies, subject to public opinion, public sentiment towards Native Americans influenced by historical understanding, traps of the citizens come to colonial ideology when it comes to neighboring sparing legislative ranks, so grabbing the issue, the nation controls, huge show up in anti-Indian rhetoric, anti-Indian movements, organized back and court running, lobbying, congressional Congress full force, and the plan is overwhelmingly is unpopular and divisive. That's foreign control of federal trust. Federal trust wants to be seen as premise and dependency of tribes, which supports continue federal involvement in tribal leaders, being in commons and pros and advantage from the rips in the field, and the federal trust response to originating the common case complaints to all each the information table of tribes and no relation to the federal trust response to be considered that self-restriction would negatively impact the federal government's responsibility to federally recognize tribes and massive environmental opposition to the plan, Native American trial times and 09 environmental sound support tribes only tribes aligned with the environmental action devised Napa along the course of the Mojave Generation Environmental Security can prevent the development of just rock energy project includes the misleading the public by saying now is posted and the emission is clean as the whole plan the EPA is ever evaluated. They said no funding means that there's no like all still not trade like all evidence about repealing the policy but not necessarily about spending and seriously about on documents better because specs and dissent because they always play the plan happens too slowly to link in education. We don't discuss marital plan or dissent in the world where they dodge the app and you should air
They say they shouldn't be responsible for racist like politicians. That justifies non-intervention in genocide.
Okay, they say that we shouldn't be responsible for racist politicians that justifies intervention in genocide. Non-intervention in genocide. All right. Back to bottom of docket. You should air name up your average first last speech trains debate. If you understand the plan is put at the top of the docket, which means much straight up the dissent and bottom of the document. This plan will get passed. Vote negative assumptions. NAACP and several very small number of bills introduced actually laws with someone heard some of the country just overrepresent bills introduced action laws. They say peace not key. That doesn't matter. That doesn't matter. That's about this and the methodology. The affirmative solves the impact claim. You can't solve other countries or the rest of the government going to war. Economic collapse that means that everybody literally freaks out, which probably proves that your ideology doesn't necessarily solve that. It's nice to the past recession, not unique to the impact, but that was a recession, not a total collapse. It's in a case that we are necessary to prevent a total collapse. There's no solvency. The immigration too long is just enough time people to solve. Internally evidence indicates that immigration is the only way to guarantee economic growth means that the dissent is necessary to solve the economic collapse.
They say that energy can't solve for poverty and everything. That argument is absolutely ridiculous. There's no policy in the status quo where wind and solar is available to people who are the most impoverished, i.e. indigenous peoples. With the passage of the plan, indigenous peoples have access to sustainable forms of energy such as wind and solar, which is key to solve poverty for several reasons. One, it prevents leakage because the capital flows out of indigenous nations because they need to spend money on services elsewhere. Two, because the expertise is not used, means it's wasted, means that there's no development. Three, there's no forms of education. Energy development feeds back into indigenous nations means that there's more development. Means we solve our poverty. They say the question is about leasing. However, argument is not about leasing. Means that all of their arguments in the case were irrelevant. Our argument is about joint ventures. It's about the ownership of indigenous peoples. There's no corporate co-option because in their joint ownership, the indigenous peoples have the opportunity to dictate terms of their land, dictate the problems, dictate what forms of energy development happen. It means that the corporate arguments are irrelevant. They say casinos solve how renewables are different from gambling. Leakage, gambling is short-term, furthermore drains money from locals for non-productive purposes. They say Holocaust, but sorry, there's no external impact to saying the word, even if utilization is harmful. Its arguments are still relevant about biopower. There's no independent impact to word use, means that there's no reason to vote for this. Vote for this onto the solar pick. The wind and sun don't shine everywhere means the wind and sun don't shine as strongly everywhere or blow as strongly everywhere means that there's a key solvency deficit to the counterplan. Furthermore, the counterplan serves to undermine self-determination. They say there's no independent reason for why wind is preferable, but I don't know. I'm not an indigenous person. Maybe I would want to prefer wind, perhaps. I live in the plains like in Idaho, and wind is a much more viable form of energy than it is solar. It's been pretty cloudy over several days in Idaho means that solar is probably not as good. I'm unable to solve for self-determination is the key problem. Furthermore, cranes evidence is ridiculous. There's no internal link between cranes and these 50 species and overall. And they can see there's no internal link between the DoD radar and extinction through terrorism because the radar is outside of the country, not inside of the country. So even if wind turbines, there's no issue. On to states, they say that congressional action is sufficient to regulate their federal policies. However, specificity is important with regards to counterplan solvency. They need to prove that it's possible. That's something they said on their own. Means that they have to have a specific piece of evidence that the counterplan is able to. The counterplan is able to function in a quasi-public scheme. All their evidence is about public regulation of interstate commerce and energy policy. Indigenous lands are not considered part of that because they're regulated by the government. It has to go through the BIA. And so unless they have evidence indicating that they can bypass federal jurisdiction, federal jurisdictions means they can't do it. It's not even a question of congressional issues. It's a question of the BIA, which is an executive function. Counterplan can't solve for the executive function onto CIR. Uniqueness overwhelms to link their evidence and their evidence indicates that Hispanic voters universally will support, which means that the Republicans want to capture the voting base, and regardless it'll happen. And they say bottom of the document, but it's not an independent reason to reject presence of other. No links is the reason why it's not an example. Reject the argument not to team on the link debate. On the link debate, extended to the Harthag Pass University. Terrors also rise in January to allow for more indigenous control, but it's not. Allow for more indigenous control means that none of these things will be. Means that Republican support. Furthermore, their cronk evidence describes trust responsibility, not definitive argument on a specific plan, not talking about popularity. And their environmental opposition evidence is about coal development. The absolves for the impact of the time frame is not actually until April. Their solvency for the economy depends on a structural change in the nature of the job market into the IT market away from services. It takes a really long time to solve. Total collapse won't happen immediately. A recession was far more disruptive, and they drop structural violence determines wartime decision making. That shelter evidence and inclusion of groups changes decision making. That Sardillian evidence means that the alternative can best solve for the post-collapse world. And furthermore, indigenous wind and solar are not relying on government aid. The government won't cancel the plan because it's not funding it. It's durable fiat means that it won't happen in the matter of economic collapse. Option 13. They consider all that evidence indicates that economic development is key for indigenous survival. You need to have a sustainable ways of rethinking. The fundamental problem with the critique is that there's a distinction between Western notions of sovereignty and self-determination. Self-determination, the guides and asks an individual concern. It's whether or not, as an individual nation, as an individual tribe, do I have the opportunity to do what I want with regards to economic development? The question is not the relationship with the government, but whether or not I have action over my land, whether or not I, as an individual, have the opportunity to become economically self-sufficient. Means that there's no link to the K. Means that there's no link to the A, which is why the permutation solves better. A permutation do the plan and reject because legal systems is key, and the legal systems is key. Can see the several distinctions. One, it's not a gift. The plan, and furthermore, the plan reduces the gifts of protection from government or corporate exploitation. Furthermore, the plan is a negative action. Means that it's impossible to live. Means that it doesn't exist. And they consider strategic essentialism argument. That's our strategic essentialism argument, ignoring the question of self-determination, denies the identity of indigenous populations. Not doing so ignores the historical legacy of colonization and perpetuates the issues of colonization. Furthermore, strategic evidence indicates that indigenous demands for equality shatter the exploitation means that self-determination, which is distinct from sovereignty, is a unique way for indigenous peoples to access the history of problems. Furthermore, associating evidence, associating Murphy evidence indicates that there's a pattern setting issue means that we can solve for a bot. And they say severance, but. No, these were reserved the right to clarify one is intent, and two ensures competition. Severance proves guarantee a true test of their argument at worst, and at worst they reject the argument and not the team. And they say that the permutation is impossible because it's about discursive framing. Their Alfred evidence is framed within the context of the government giving indigenous peoples sovereignty. Our argument is that we remove this possibility that enables indigenous peoples for action to do it themselves.
We'll concede the link to the after criticism. They're not going to be able to garner any offense that's external to the counterclaim means that there's no reason, and also we'll concede the permutation is just test competition. Don't let them advocate it. Don't let them advocate that they haven't made any arguments about why they should be able to go to the win pick as well. We'll concede the win pick. We'll concede the win pick. The win's probably a good idea. You haven't made any conditionality arguments also means that we can probably go for the state's counterclaim by itself. So far, the only argument that they are extending is a question of whether or not the United States federal government has whether or not the state interstate compact can have authority to overturn existing pieces of legislation. The Terra Act, which was passed through Congress, is what gave the authority to the BIA to require to put the requirements in the status quo on the development of energy outside the lane inside the status quo. Our David and Brandt are correct evidence indicates that you can overturn existing pieces of federal legislation through an interstate compact, and you can take authority away from the federal. Our previous evidence indicates that you can take authority away from the federal government with the interstate compact, and it will not get rolled back. They do not make a permutation argument. They do not make a links to politics argument, and they do not make a solvency deficit argument external to the no authority arguments. Means that it is only a question of whether or not whether or not it is possible or not. And we are the only ones reading evidence that you do not record one on whether or not it is to fail, whether or not it is possible. Means that this is only literally there's only risk of voting negative. Go to the politics flow. The economic decline is the controlling impact leads to radical shifts and radical power shifts, which increase the risk of miscalculation, triggers low expectation of trade, which cause the countries to fight in protectionist wars, or resource democratic states will fight transition wars. That's a royal evidence. This turns case 3 ways. A is economic collapse means the natives can't spend can't make any money. B is companies violently take over native land in order to make the money. And C prevents natives from doing things like solar and wind energy because they can't afford it and because no private company can afford to work at it. This isn't a durable fee argument. This is an argument that the United States economy is too screwed up for us to have external investors to make these joint partnerships that solve for the majority of the Africans. If they're not going to be able to solve as offense against it, and they've had the fastest time frame. We're on the breaking back of the collapse. We need CIR now to prevent total collapse. Our internal evidence is excellent about CIR solving things like job loss, tax revenues, entrepreneurship means the default negative should always focus on saving the human race for the longest amount of times, and we can always either have from or later and economic decline. Turns structural violence exacerbates poverty, causes widespread mental trauma. That's our WHO. And if there is no offense in the 1AR, means that only a risk of triggering the link and vote negative because the disout outweighs they mess up our scenario. It's that in the gang of 8 we'll get a deal on CIR now, but the affirmative forces Congress to shift focus from CIR means it won't pass quick enough to solve the econ. It guarantees the impact. Also reasons why none of their link turns are reasons why the link turns are responsive. The uniqueness for CIR will pass now because of momentum in both houses, but the focus is waning from gun control and debt issues. The time frame is April 1st. That's our Berman and Lillis. Evans focus is waning. Proves the uniqueness doesn't overwhelm the link. You do not get to go for a link turn. You don't get to go for a link turn argument, and a uniqueness overwhelms the link argument. The 1AR is only a defensive speech. Ideology outweighs proves that the affirmative is unpopular. All that interactive states the Republicans should like the plan, not that they necessarily do. Proves the status quo conservatives conceptually the native. Outweighs the link turns. Congress needs the plan for 4 reasons. A, it doesn't want to relinquish control over natives' lands. That's our Kronk. That's our Kronk evidence. They say it's not specific enough, but it's specific to the question of how the interpretation of the trust clause happens. How it is debated in Congress, which is enough to trigger the focus link. And B, the public sentiment is against native self-determination, which Congress is. This is how ideology outweighs their link turns. Links turn, this is in the context there. How ideology outweighs the link turn. So view it through that lens. That's our Gileo evidence. And the C legislative history proves that the absent and popular. That's our Kronk evidence. And that delay kills bill means that you're not going to be able to solve the other economy. They say structural violence in terms of decision making, but you can't solve other countries or the rest of the government going to war. Economic collapse means that everybody literally destroy that means that everybody literally freaks out, which means that any of the things in terms of this are destroyed. I'll go ahead and preempt any sort of new cross applications from the case argument. First, they don't get to make any sort of arguments about how their advocacy is uniquely good because we're going for the counterplan in the context of we're going for the counterplan with the politics. That means we are not telling you to ignore the struggles of Native Americans, just that we have a better way to solve. If we win any risk of structural violence as a result of the affirmative plan, that's a reason to why it is more ethically messed up for you to vote against the counterplan, meaning that there's no external ethics to say that the counterplan is going to be able to solve. Go to the case flow. We don't have that. They are not winning any sort of case flow. Any sort of case arguments that are external to the development of the act. They are making arguments about sustainability. But I think if the counterplan is able to overturn existing legislation, that would lead to the same amount of investment happening inside of Indian countries. So I set up the same types of models that are necessary to solve. They also dropped my argument on the counterplan flow that we provide. That's a better form of modeling because it's a more decentralized model where power is closer to its constituents. Means that that's probably at least a risk of it means that it's a reason to why you shouldn't allow a new 2A argument that might answer that argument to come out as an external net benefit to the as offense against the counterplan. They say joint ownership. However, we still allow for joint ownership. No reason why we wouldn't be able to overturn it. Terror restrictions are specific to the content. Yeah, terror restrictions are in place because of a piece of federal legislation. If we win, the states can overturn any piece of federal legislation that they want through an interstate Congress, and the Congress is not going to roll it back. And that is the reason to why the counterplan solves 100%. In a world where they are not extending offense in the side that 1AR on the counter or in the disad flow, that means that there is literally only that it literally becomes only a risk of offense for the negative. There's their best, they make this argument, they make one argument on the counterplan, they do not read a piece of evidence in the context of this. It's only a risk that they don't read any, they do not have a piece of evidence in the context of this. I think that they spent way too much time on the K. They do not make any solvency deficit arguments. Protect my ass on this one.
The only case arguments they made were why state overturning federal legislation might result in the types of solvency for energy that they're talking about. They make no arguments about how the state could solve for the relationship between the federal government and indigenous peoples. This is key to our reparations arguments and our arguments about including decision makers in federal decision making, because the United States federal government goes to war, not states. Even if the states incorporate indigenous peoples into, allow in some way for indigenous peoples to develop the type of energy that they're talking about through the interstate compact, there's no way that the states are able to change the government's relationship with indigenous people so that they can account for decision-making, respond to structural violence in a way that ends the psychological priming that we're talking about. This relation, even if this argument wasn't explicitly made on the case flow, it was made throughout the sovereignty flow, and it was made throughout the politics disad. There's no articulation of how the states would be able to solve for this relationship, which means that the plan is the only thing that can reorient our knowledge production so that we avoid extinction in the future. Now on the critique flow, we have offense. We need to disintegrate the system of Western sovereignty that enables annihilation. Our Zizek evidence indicates that the small demand for equality is what is more threatening to the system than the status quo. Biopolitics means that the plan is able to reject the government control over niche population that enables things like going to war because we devalue certain populations, then enable their destruction. Our Schreber evidence supports this by saying psychological priming is enabled by structural violence against certain populations, but people aren't able to make their own decisions, and when we have to subordinate ourselves to a Western notion of sovereignty like the government controls all of us, that is when we result in the annihilation scenarios that their critique was talking about. Only by asserting outside government control like indigenous sovereignty, which is different, are we able to disintegrate these systems and present alternative models. Because they have their own annihilation impact on the sovereignty flow, means you default to the affirmative because we're the only thing that assured deals with assured annihilation that's coming in the status quo, and the counterplan doesn't because it does not reorient the government relationship. Now on the states. The neg says that they only need to demonstrate what the counterplan is possible, means the burden of evidence is on them, not us. Specificity is important with regard to plausibility because otherwise creates the incentive for the neg or impossible counterplans with no requirement to defend jurisdiction. Any counterplan is competitive, incentivizes bad debates, even absent evidence. There's no articulation about how the states can affect removing a restriction on executive branch functions. They say compacts can override, but the mechanism of state compacts is important. The evidence only says that if Congress rejects a state compact, then the state can override. It says nothing about the states being able to overturn executive branch function. It's not congressional. Also, the evidence is purely speculative. It says there's been no compacts in the past. It says that there's no real reason they could possibly see why it might be overrun. It doesn't mean that Congress won't override it or find a reason. Also, 1NC Craig evidence says that compacts may be solved as to solve for coordinating a multi-state and private energy program. It does say it can remove a restriction on a federal energy policy. And on the 1NC Craig evidence, also wording is key. A multi-state renewable energy program refers to programs across states. Indigenous energy products may not conform to this. Indigenous lands are unique and quasi-public, which is why the BIA has sole jurisdiction over this. Also, the fact that there's uncertainty means you have to default to the affirmative because the only ones who reorient the government's relationship with indigenous peoples are ill, and evidence indicates that by including more people in government decision-making, we're able to reorient these decisions towards justice. Only by changing federal government decision-making, we're able to reorient government policies that are harmful towards indigenous peoples and other populations around the globe. Also, the state compacts evidence is purely speculative. They have no evidence specific to indigenous or the capacity to override. The uncertainty, the burden of evidence is on the neg, which means you should default to the affirmative because the only thing that assuredly overrides these restrictions. Also, the fact that there might be uncertainty is the reason why people wouldn't invest, because they think that Congress might override in the future, which means that there's less solvency for energy under their thing. Now on the politics. First, uniqueness overwhelms the link. The Parker and Straw evidence indicates that they're scrambling to halt eroding support among Hispanic voters. It indicates that where they know Romney voted lost decisively, the Republicans are forced to accept a compromise because they need to attract more Hispanic voters. This is key because it means that Republicans will have to come around on a comprehensive immigration reform bill. They made no distinction as to why the Gang of Eight bill is different from the one they were talking about, which means that the type of bill that is going to be developed to solve the economy would necessarily happen. Also, the government fights in wars, not states, which means we say government decision-making are so Chamberlain and Trevor evidence indicates that we need to reorient the government's relationship with populations so that it doesn't exclude them and devalue them, which enables us to go to wars of annihilation. Also, economic collapse doesn't mean that energy is destroyed because there's no investment. If it's economically viable, our evidence indicates people would still invest in these projects. Also, indigenous economies are destroyed in the status quo, which means there's only a reason that there is the risk of the plan solving. And SOCI means that we'd reorient our relationship anyway so that the government would make policies that would still enable the populations to achieve, to get out of structural violence, even if the economy collapsed, because we would still value populations rather than not. They say that the economic decline causes structural violence, but a question of what we address, not the consequences of the action. We need to reorient our moves to our actions towards addressing structural violence, not the consequences, even if there was an economic collapse that led to structural violence. Only the plan is something that would enable it. Now in the link debate, first, they make a new focus argument, but the fact that Obama's gallivanting in the Middle East and is doing all these other things indicates that there's no shift in focus. This is a new articulation. All the link evidence prefers us. First is Stretch. The Hearth Act passed unanimously means you defer to all of our link terms. The second reasons are like is Jones evidence indicates that Republicans first hate regulation. Democrats like indigenous development, which means if they default to ideology, they just vote for the plan and ignore any long-term impacts. Third, the only reason they might dislike it is environmental. But A, Croc 1 and C evidence is relying on speculation since they may oppose removing environmental regulation. And second, their own Native American Times evidence indicates that environmentalists hate coal development on indigenous lands. In fact, there was coal development in the status quo indicates that they would support a move to renewables, which means that the plan is the only thing that's going to be able to spur further support for getting immigration reform. The impact won't be till April. The economics describe structural changes in the economy. They say that there's public sentiments against, but this is just relying on speculation. The fact that the Hearth Act passed disproves the idea because this is from 2007. They also say they don't want to relinquish control, but this describes the trust responsibility. It says nothing about political orientation towards indigenous people. There's no way a unanimous vote is going to become a contested one that Obama needs to use political capital, and they also dropped our structural violence determined decision making. Even if the result, we still need to care to respond to advocacy. Even if advocacy isn't irrelevant, the U.S.-indigenous relationship is. The plan is key to pattern setting, so we develop policies that don't result in the type of wars they're talking about as a result of the plan. Only the plan stops the type of wars that would result from economic decision making enables indigenous development.